Hook, the silver switch. In the late Ming, a single number quietly governed daily life, the amount of silver required to pay taxes. One chronicler record, repeated and reframed by later compilers, points to a turning point where the state's preference for silver payments grew from a practical accommodation into a full financial dependency. And once that dependency took hold, the dynasty's ability to govern became hostage to the same forces that shaped silver's value far away in the world economy. Silver-backed notes. That was the invention and the destruction. When we talk about the silver addiction, we're not claiming Ming officials personally chased a substance the way a novel chases a villain. The metaphor is fiscal. Ming governance increasingly relied on silver to move wealth, paying taxes, funding armies, and purchasing supplies. The trouble is that silver is not an agricultural output. It's an input imported through trade and mediated through markets. To understand how the Ming became dependent, start with what earlier dynasties already knew. Taxation can be collected in multiple forms, but it has to be convertible into the state's spending needs. Earlier Ming policies used grain more heavily, partly because grain is bulky, yet familiar, and partly because it aligns with the administrative reality of local storage and transport. But over time, local officials and merchants pushed for silver because silver was easier to consolidate and transport across distances. Picture a tax season, not as a courtroom scene, but as a grinding logistical cycle. A county magistrate doesn't carry coin in a pocket. He manages people who collect, people who transport, and people who enforce. If the law says grain, someone must store it, someone must ship it, and someone must prevent losses. If the law allows silver, someone must weigh it, someone must assay it informally, and someone must fight it in the local economy. And that's the pivot. Once silver becomes the common denominator, everything else becomes a conversion problem. In late Ming China, silver wasn't invented by the Ming. It arrived through global trade networks. American silver, routed through Spanish and Portuguese channels, made its way across oceans and then into Eurasian markets. In East Asia, that silver didn't land as a finished government payment. It arrived as commodity metal, and then it turned into money because people agreed it was usable. The key mechanism was exchange. Merchants who dealt in overseas goods could bring in silver. Coastal economies could then pass silver inland. The state could try to tax using silver. Or more subtly, it could allow silver to substitute for grain in practice. When the substitution hardens into policy, the fiscal system changes. Now, zoom in on the state. The Ming government faced persistent expenses. Maintaining garrisons, funding transport of essentials, and responding to rebellion and frontier tensions. Even if a particular year's crisis was unpredictable, the administrative expectation was predictable. The state must pay, and local officials must deliver. When grain-based taxation faces bottlenecks, bad harvests, bandit routes, or transport cost, officials look for flexibility. Silver offers that flexibility because it compresses value into portable metal. A clumsy but accurate analogy is that silver behaves like a liquidity asset in a world where liquidity is scarce. But liquidity can dry up. And silver's supply is not governed by the county magistrate's wishes. Chapter 2. The long coastal run. The dynasty's dependence didn't start everywhere at once. It deepened where trade links were strongest. Coastal provinces and cities where merchants could bridge between international inflows and inland needs. On the coast, silver could be acquired through commerce. Merchants might trade in salt, textiles, and foreign goods. They also negotiated in local networks of credit, informal but real. Credit matters because taxes aren't just a legal event. They're an economic shock. If the taxpayer must produce silver at a deadline, the taxpayer must either already have silver or borrow to obtain it. Borrowing isn't free. If silver becomes scarce, interest rises. If silver becomes expensive relative to grain, the real tax burden on households increases, even if the nominal tax is constant. The late Ming's fiscal stress shows up in how conversion rules worked on the ground. Chronicles repeatedly describe disputes over rates. How many taels of silver a unit of grain was supposed to represent, and how local officials and merchants applied those rates. The problem isn't just that rates differed, it's that the system incentivized manipulation. A flexible rate is a recipe for rent-seeking. If local enforcement can interpret acceptable silver quality or exchange ratios, then officials can adjust outcomes without changing the law. That adjustment can be concealed as assay differences or transport adjustments. Meanwhile, the state's own needs were changing. When the government demanded silver for military expenses, local officials had to procure it. When it couldn't procure enough silver, it had to delay purchases, negotiate unofficial substitutions, or squeeze local populations harder. Hush, hush. Chapter 3. Taxes become market pain. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, the conversion of taxation into silver payments created a new kind of political economy. It wasn't merely a matter of government collecting from people. It was a matter of government amplifying market volatility. Let's make it concrete. Suppose a household produces grain. If taxes shift towards silver, that household must sell grain for silver, or buy silver with whatever cash or credit it can raise. If silver becomes harder to obtain or its price in grain terms rises, the household pays more grain's worth. And households don't experience markets as charts. They experience them as hunger, delayed repairs, or children not fed properly. Even when the chronicles use formal language about policy failures and local disorder, the underlying mechanism is often economic. The Ming state was not blind to this. Many memorials to the throne argued about fiscal design, transport costs, and the burdens of conversion. But the state faced a dilemma. Abandoning silver risked operational collapse in a system already structured around silver procurement. Sticking with silver preserved administrative continuity while making the state vulnerable to fluctuations in supply and value. There's also another hard-to-see dynamic. Silver's entry into local life reshaped credit. When silver is required for taxes, credit expands around silver. Moneylenders and middlemen can thrive, and the effective tax becomes layered. In many late Ming accounts, grievances involve not only the tax itself, but the intermediaries who handle collection and exchange. Middlemen can sound like a modern insult, but in historical terms, they are the financial infrastructure between state demands and household realities. So, the silver dependency becomes more than a policy. It becomes a network. Hush, hush. Chapter 4. Collapse of fiscal elasticity. A state can survive shocks if it has fiscal elasticity, if it can raise revenue, borrow, or adjust spending without breaking its own legitimacy. The late Ming had less elasticity than it needed. Why? Because the state's revenue stream depended on silver flows that were not fully controllable. Domestic silver could be taxed, but the state didn't mint it. It could regulate exchange, but it couldn't stop the broader market from moving. Additionally, political conflict in the capital reduced administrative consistency. When factions fight, They don't just trade insults. They alter policy priorities, redirect blame, and disrupt bureaucratic execution. That matters for a fiscal system because implementation is where conversion ratios, procurement schedules, and enforcement capacity become real. Now, bring in the external pressures. The late Ming period sees climate volatility and localized disasters. Flooding, drought, and crop failures were not created by silver dependency, but they interact with it. In a bad harvest year, households have less grain to sell. If the tax still demands silver, at fixed schedules, households have fewer assets to meet that requirement. A grain tax can be adjusted more readily through local assessment and storage policy. But a silver tax demands that households obtain a metal they may not be able to purchase when harvests fail. The result is not automatic rebellion, but it is a faster route to desperation. Furthermore, when fiscal stress meets military pressure, the state's spending choices become brittle. Armies need food, equipment, and pay. If silver is expensive or scarce, payroll can lag, procurement can be disrupted, and discipline can erode. Some late Ming accounts discuss how troops demanded payment or how supply systems broke down in the face of shortages. Modern historians often emphasize that multiple causes converged: fiscal policy, corruption, climate shocks, and political fragmentation. So where does the silver addiction thesis land? It lands in the feedback loop. Silver dependence made the state's finances more sensitive to changes it couldn't control, which reduced the ability to absorb shocks, which then made those shocks politically catastrophic. To keep this grounded, it helps to describe how the silver economy actually functioned. Silver didn't just sit in vaults. It moved through merchants, brokers, and local collection agents. Local silver handling involved weighing and quality judgments. Real people know that metals aren't uniform. There are differences in fineness, wear, and shape. Even if the state set formal standards, daily transactions relied on practical judgments. This creates an opening for dispute. If a collection agent claims a certain ingot is less pure, the taxpayer pays more silver or suffers deductions. If a buyer claims a higher weight, the collector can negotiate. These details become emotional because they're tangible. We also need to talk about how the state tried to reconcile the system with its administrative routines. A court that wants silver payments often confronts officials who still think and plan in grain terms. That mismatch produces delays and inconsistencies. When the mismatch persists, corruption becomes easier. Not because every official is a schemer, but because discretion grows in areas without transparent benchmarks. A tax system that requires constant conversion but lacks precise enforcement invites gaming. Memorials and discussions in late Ming bureaucratic sources reflect this. Historians have long pointed out that the late Ming state made choices that tightened its link to market outcomes, especially through the silverization of revenue. But we must be careful with certainty. Historians debate how dominant silver was among the many forces that brought down the dynasty. Some argue silver dependency was a major structural driver. Others see it as one influential factor among broader political and military failures. The truth is probably both. The silver economy didn't cause every rebellion, but it changed how crises translated into state weakness. Chapter 6. Fall without a single cause. Now we move toward the end, not with a single villain, but with the question of how a dynasty fails when multiple stresses stack. By the time major rebellions and military upheavals accelerated, the Ming had already endured years of financial and administrative strain. The state faced the problem of funding and feeding forces while also maintaining governance across regions. When silver is part of the funding logic, the problem becomes especially sharp. If provincial officials need silver to fulfill quotas and cannot obtain it at reasonable cost, they delay. Delays turn into gaps. Delays turn into gaps. Gaps turn into disorder. Disorder turns into political crisis. It's tempting to say, silver fell, so the dynasty fell. That's too simple. Silver's value is affected by global markets. Local economies react with lag. Government policy and enforcement matter. War reorganizes everything. But silver can still be a multiplier. It can magnify how quickly a shock becomes unmanageable. In the late Ming, the political narrative, in many accounts, becomes one of illegitimacy. Who deserves to rule? Who can provide security? Who can deliver order? Fiscal capacity is the invisible foundation for that legitimacy. When fiscal capacity fails, security contracts. When security contracts, people stop trusting the state. When people stop trusting the state, rebellions become easier to sustain. So, the silver dependency story is not supernatural and not moralistic. It's about structural incentives and operational constraints. And in that sense, addiction is metaphor again. The Ming state adapted to silver because it solved problems, then became unable to function without it. Hash. Chapter 7. What you would do. The silver addiction thesis invites a final question. Could the Ming have changed course in time? Could officials have reduced dependence, diversified revenue, or rebuilt an alternative fiscal mechanism? We can't rewrite history, but we can ask what levers existed. The most obvious lever was the tax structure, how much depended on silver versus grain, and how conversion rates were set and enforced. Another lever was credit and exchange regulation, which is hard because markets develop despite rules. Yet another lever was political stability and administrative integrity, because even a good fiscal design can fail when enforcement is inconsistent. So here's the reflection that matters. When a state builds its revenue system on an imported monetary input, it gains efficiency in normal times and risks fragility in crisis. The Ming's tragedy is that crisis arrived while fragility was already embedded. We don't need to invent villains. We just need to follow the money trail, carefully, patiently, and with respect for how complex a dynasty really was. What would you have done first if you were advising the late Ming court? Reform the conversion rules, rebalance taxes away from silver, or try to stabilize the procurement network through policy and enforcement?